So thank you, Andrew. Our next TED Talk speaker, who I'm thrilled to introduce, is Jenna Hoff. She's an Edmonton-based freelance writer and editor who's passionate about older child adoption, social justice, and inclusion from a faith-based perspective. Living with physical and communication disabilities for many years, as well as mothering children, teenagers, and young adults with disabilities, has given her a unique perspective in advocating for an accessible, gentler, kinder world for all. So you can just Google Jenna's name and you will bump into some great articles that I got to read. So Calgary, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you for such a nice introduction. How is my volume? Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Can the other groups hear you, Jenna? Yeah, they can? Okay.
Fantastic. I'll begin by telling you a story that happened on a bright spring day several years ago. On that day, I was buzzing with excitement as I prepared to go to an event similar to the one we are at today. Deciding to go took more gumption than you might imagine. A few years before, I'd lost the ability to walk. Many things I once took for granted that made it easy to go to events like this one had vanished. I could no longer just jump in my car to drive myself to the event, walk in, introduce myself verbally, and simply blend in with the majority of people there. I was still adjusting to what it is like to be the one who is viewed as different, whose legs are sometimes stared at, whose communication device can inspire nervous giggles. Today, after 8 years of fighting hard, I've surprisingly recovered a lot of mobility and am classified an ambulatory wheelchair user. This means that I walk with a cane a fairly good distance and use a wheelchair for outings like today's conference. I can now drive an adapted wheelchair van. But that morning several years ago, as I prepared to go to that event, the mobility gains I would eventually make had yet to come, and I was in this inner adjustment phase of figuring out how to still live well despite the recent changes in my ability level and in how society sees and interacts with me. I felt incredibly vulnerable as I adjusted to life with mobility disabilities. But I also was determined to not give up, to keep living with joy the life God gave me. So, after carefully confirming with the organizers that it would be held in a wheelchair-accessible building, I registered for the event. Since I could no longer drive, I took the city bus. The ride went smoothly enough at first, until I got off the bus. As the bus peeled away, I discovered the bus stop was situated inside a small inaccessible concrete island about 20 feet in diameter. On my right was an enormous unscalable hill, on my left a busy road. A crosswalk jutted out from this concrete island, went across the road, and ended at a sidewalk on the other side. From there, all I needed to do was roll my chair a few blocks to the event. This would have been simple enough for a person on foot. However, to my dismay, I discovered the crosswalk was not wheelchair accessible. It didn't have sloping curbs to easily get my chair down onto the crosswalk. But I'd gotten this far. Do you think I was going to give up now? So, with great difficulty, I flung my chair off the concrete island. I went over the curb and landed with a bang on the crosswalk. I made it across the road. Unfortunately, on reaching the other side, I discovered that curb 2 was completely inaccessible, even more than the one on the concrete island. I couldn't get from the crosswalk onto the sidewalk that would take me to the event. No amount of chair flinging or grit and determination could get me up that curb. In desperation, I texted my husband at his work for help. Immediately, Eric raced out, picked me up from where I was stranded, and drove me to the event. Once at the event, I pasted a bright smile on my face, determined to not let anyone see how rattled I was at how hard something as simple as getting to the event had been for me. A month or so later, this group held another event. This time it would be held in a different building, so I again confirmed in advance with the event organizers that the building was wheelchair accessible. Thankfully, I made it there without incident. This event would be smooth sailing. To my shock, the door opened into a tiny stairwell, in front of which was a very large, very tall, very non-wheelchair friendly staircase. My heart began to pound as I stared at all those stairs, wondering what on earth to do now. However, all hope wasn't lost. Fastened to the side was a rickety wheelchair lift. I stared at it with fascination. How on earth did the contraption work? Eventually, some other meeting attendees entered and summoned the event organizers. Chaos ensued until it was determined the lift needed a key to operate. None of the event organizers had the key. After numerous calls to the building manager, they discovered only the janitor had this magic key. However, he wasn't working that day. The janitor said he'd drive the key into the building and be there in 3 hours. But by then, the event would be long over. Amazingly, at this point, several meeting attendees stepped in and together carried my heavy chair up all those stairs. I made it to the event. This situation, as well as many others over the years, taught me much about why accessibility, equity, and inclusion so critically matter. This is true for all spheres of life, in schools, churches, bus stops, families, friendships, and everywhere else. When even getting to or entering a building is an enormous obstacle, it's very hard to function on an equitable level. As much as our society is growing towards greater inclusivity and universal accessibility, there is still so much further to go. However, as illustrated by how the event attendees carted my chair up the stairs, I've found that by and large, when people are confronted by a direct, visible need, they want to help. I see this over and over, from people who run ahead to hold a door for me to those who have pushed me out of the snow the many times I've gotten stuck. You see, while I'm not going to let an Edmonton winter stop me, my chair has no such determination about Edmonton's winters. The chair takes no joy in being outside. Resultingly, hundreds of times over the years, I've gotten my wheelchair stuck in the snow, my tires spinning desperately. But, would you believe it, every single time, people stop to help. I've yet to be stuck for long floundering in snowbanks. It's amazing how when people see a middle-aged, visibly disabled woman in a wheelchair struggling in the snow, they are without fail generous with care and assistance. Heartbreakingly, I can also attest that this generosity of care and assistance does not always extend in the same way to people who live with an invisible disability. An invisible disability is not easily apparent or visible, but nonetheless can significantly impact a person's life and ability to function. While I live with visible disabilities, all 4 of my kids live with an invisible disability. Time and again, I've witnessed the heartbreak of rejection and lack of inclusion they experience, especially my now adult son. You would hope this would be different within the Christian community who are called to love God and neighbor, but crushingly, that has not often been our experience. My oldest son has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and moderate cognitive disability. When you meet him, he looks completely typical. You would not know at first glance that he lives with an invisible disability. While the church was completely physically accessible to my son, who has no physical disability, relationally, socially, and emotionally inclusion didn't happen. In his early 20s, I'd bring him to church on Sundays. How he despised going to church, how difficult it was for him. The language of the sermons was too hard for him to understand. He hated the worship music. It was incredibly difficult for him to sit quietly for the length of the service. My son embraces a goth style of clothing different than anyone else in the church. His countenance sometimes had an angry glare. The trauma of his first 20 years before he joined my family through adoption was etched into every aspect of his posture. When he was bored, which was most of the time, he'd kick the pew ahead or pinch his sister to make her laugh, or make silly noises to get attention. This may have been reacted to with a little more compassion, or at least not rejection, if he was a young child. But it never went well when a 230-pound man who didn't look disabled was doing these things, even though he was cognitively probably similar to that young child. The tension was incredibly high. In all the years we brought him to church, he didn't make a single friend. At the end of the services, I myself sitting in my wheelchair had many fellow congregants who'd come talk to me, show me in tangible ways that despite my differences I was welcomed and a loved part of the church body. While an older gentleman would sometimes say hello to my son and speak to him a little, more often than not, my son sat slumped alone on the pew. Finally, I realized that to bring my son to church was to push him away from God. That was the end of bringing him to church. But, by then it was too late. By then he announced that he not only didn't believe in God, but had decided to be a Satanist. I think this was the furthest he could think of to rebel against Christianity, which to him meant boredom, friendlessness, and difficulty. Today at age 28, my son struggles to the extreme. He seeks out the dark aspects of life, and has found solace and friendship with others who are similarly on the edge of society, who like him struggle immensely, and live a life of great pain and hurt. He has been taken advantage of and harmed more times than I can count. As his mother, I have known tremendous, continuous heartbreak through a roller coaster of desperate, frantic, fruitless attempts to help him. He lives a life of high risk. Last summer, he ended up on the streets for a month, until we and other family members were able to get him to safety. As his mother, My heart has shattered time and again and again and again. I wonder, what could I and my husband have done better in parenting him? We've tried hard, so very, 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 very hard. Maybe the obstacles were just too high in adopting a 20-year-old who had already been brutally hurt by the world. I don't in any way blame the Christian community for my son's struggles and pain, or for my heartbreak as his desperate mother. But I do think of my son slouching alone in the pew after Sunday services. I wonder if someone had genuinely befriended him, truly shown him Christ's love, if that could have helped, if it could have changed the course his life has gone. Love makes a difference. When I think back over the years to those Sundays when I was surrounded by friends at the end of the service, and my angry, sullen, hurting child sat alone, I am struck by where I think Jesus would have been. I think it is to my son that Jesus would have beelined after the service. I envision him talking to him, putting his arm gently around his shoulders, welcoming him, including him, building an accessible, equitable friendship. The Bible describes Jesus as seeking out, welcoming, including those who didn't necessarily fit into mainstream society. Jesus was a friend to those who hurt, those who struggled, those for whom life was hard. Isn't that what inclusion is, at its heart? We who love God are called to follow this example of love to all people, including those we encounter who have disabilities, be they visible or invisible. Not out of pity, not as a way to earn brownie points, not to feel superior. We are called to love those who God brings across our paths, and that includes inclusivity and accessibility in our openness, humility, friendship, and love. Thank you.